Alrighty, I figured with all the stuff going on, it was about time for me to finally sit down. Let's talk what is Rainbow Rydia. And as always with a good deck profile, we need to go, why are we talking about Rainbow Rydia? This wasn't a deck that was on my list of the best decks in the game when I first went through and started, evaluating decks for the early part of the format. And now you see Rydia is almost completely sold out on TCG Player with crazy sales volumes. Her price is spiked. What happened? One more picture. You see Warrior of Light really... People might not realize this now. Warrior of Light was not a very hyped legend when the set was first fully spoiled. You see he was about only, $3 for a legend before now spiking to be 13 with very low listings on market. You see the way that this graph ended up going. And I see that my display capture does not have my cursor. Let's turn that on. So you see this like massive increase over time in the price of Warrior of Light, and that's entirely due to the dominance of this deck over to basically we're I think a little past the midpoint of the Opus's release in the format. So let's talk about this real quick. We're going to talk about a history of 2CP Rydia. And to talk about 2CP Rydia, we have to go all the way back to Opus 14 before Rydia was ever released. This is Sophie Doga. And Sophie Doga is maybe one of the most powerful toxic decks in the history of the game. It was a deck that intended to use Sophie as a win condition, and this deck was discovered around the end of Opus 13. Hilariously, it was discovered in L3. People kind of realized that like Sophie was really, really good still, but without a lot of the tools to enable her, like Lena and Minwoo, they were just kind of hurting for playables. So they started running Doga in the list as well, and Doga is banned for a reason. Doga is the best deep draw engine that the game's ever had. And Doga just happened to be Earth-Water, and any Earth-Water forward pairs with Sophie and kind of multiplies the power of the card. And so you end up with this monstrosity of a deck, one that essentially is not trying to play Final Fantasy at all. It's just trying to get Sophie and a bunch of forwards and win the game before the opponent has any chance to do anything, while also running 3, 6, 8, 10, 13. We're on probably 20-ish EX burst here. Maybe 15. But again, this list wasn't looking to play backups at all outside of maybe a Sarah into a Kolka on turn 1. And this was probably the best deck in the game. Maybe tied with Stern Chocobos in Opus 14. It was a 2-deck format. You were playing these decks or you were playing to beat these decks, and there was nothing else really worth playing, right? And at the start of Opus 15, we knew that Rydia was coming. I don't have a picture of her here, so let's go ahead and go to FF decks, and we're gonna pull up 2CP Rydia because I think it's actually important to see what Rydia is. So Rydia is a 2CP Earth forward. If she takes damage from your summons or abilities, the damage becomes 0 instead, which means that she has to die by either combat or an outright break effect. Very, very important. I think the card would be pretty much unplayable, actually, if she didn't have that line of text, but it's part of what makes her so difficult to deal with. Fire decks, ice decks, so many decks have trouble getting Rydia off the field, meaning that she starts generating value perpetually. And when Rydia starts generating value, she generates a lot of value. She has a 0-cost action ability to cast a summon of cost equal or less than the number of growth counters on Rydia once per turn without paying the cost. And she gets 2 every time she or a Category 4 character enters the field. This builds up very quickly and doesn't take very many counters for this to become good. Usually, once you get her to 4, she can cast Sildra, Amat, and Mist Dragon, and once you can do that, you don't really need to cast much else for the card to be good. She just needs one other Category 4 character to pair with her. And the card designers kind of just realized right at the start of Opus 15, oh shit, our best deck in the game is going to abuse the hell out of this card. We're already on 25 summons. It's very easy to swap a couple of these cards out for a couple copies of Purim, and some of our backups out for Leonora's, and Ursula's already Category 4, and we're going to have a problem on our hands. And they banned Doga, and they put Sophie to 1. And this ended up kind of taking the wind out of that Rydia's sails. She kind of was slept on for a little bit. A lot of people try to make her work in what was called RPP, Rydia Purim, but it wasn't until about the beginning of Opus 16, I want to say, that a list very similar to this one ended up winning an event in Japan. I don't have the original list, unfortunately. But it was a list that it dropped the Palom entirely and all of the fire cards and just said, what if we went Earth Water? And you kind of made Sophie Doga without the Doga. Doga being gone means that you instead would play the 3 Rydia, and you used Moogle and Poo-Poo as a draw engine in the same way that Doga used to try to help you set up consistent Sophie access while using Rydia to flood your opponent in card advantage. 25 summons with Moogle and Poo-Poo means that Mashari has a lot of value here. You can power up the Rydia very quickly using Ursula and Yang, but Ursula into Sophie also represents damage, also means you can cast any of your summons up to here. And it was this very fast, consistent, I called it aggro control, because the deck really didn't want to set up. Wanted turn 1, you would go Sarah into Kolka, search your Rydia. Turn 2, you would play Rydia into Purim into hopefully a Sildra. But sometimes you go like Rydia, cast Poo-Poo or Moogle, and try to like dig for your next Category 4 character. And the goal was just to have a Mist Dragon and Amaterasu to protect this field while you kind of ran your opponent down with rampant card advantage from Rydia, Mashari. This deck was really, really good with one caveat. It actually has a very, very poor mono-water matchup. Turns out when you have a very high investment forward that needs to stay on the field after getting powered up, having that forward return to your hand doesn't feel very good. So keeping Rydia powered up in that matchup was really hard. You have to pivot to like this weird Purim, Mashari game plan in the matchup against Folka mono-water. It was rough. This deck was still very, very good. I think in 2-deck formats it would have been one of the best decks in the game, but there was competition. And this deck kept getting refined more and more. My 2 decks for a long time were Earthwind cast focus decks. It was just Earthwind at first, then it transitioned into Retainer Storm. And then it was this deck, once this was discovered. I really, really liked the kind of aggro, protect the castle playstyle that Rydia gave you. I'm sure Travis will definitely laugh about how many times he's faced this list, because both me and one of my testing partners, and Alex Hoodsclaw, are very big fans of this list. So you see, this was what I thought was the last hurrah, which was Opus 17. And you see we've kind of I started diversifying the card pool a bit. We went from 18 forwards up to 21 just because of really powerful cards like Minwoo and Alfino, making it kind of feel better to go for that. Arciela found a home in the list as well. We cut down on our Purims. We split our Purims. We went down to just we had to cut the Mashri, so she got banned, but stuff like Orin and Minwoo to help protect our Rydia ended up being really, really good. You see our summon count ended up being more diversified as well. Things like the 3CP Titan to avoid damage-focused board wipes. This list is really, really, really good and really, really fun. And then something happened in Opus 18, which was the printing of... We're going to go over here. Lena. Lena was the worst thing that could have happened to Rydia. Lena caused a resurgence in mono water, which was just the natural nemesis to Rydia. I actually took a very similar list to this to one of the bigger online tournaments, the Zanarkand Open, and did very terribly, just because the matchup spread was just not there for the deck. Against one of the best decks in the format, it was essentially an auto loss, and there's just not much you can do about that. So I thought this deck went dormant, and they revealed that there was a new Rydia backup that seemed really, really good. But there's something that's really interesting. A lot of people that don't follow, say you only do your regional meta, you only follow NA, maybe you follow NA and EU, but you don't follow Japan. And something very strange in Japan is that Japan never gave up on twins as an archetype. It's been effectively the most played tournament deck, I would say, in Japan since Opus 15 on average. Japan just Japan plays twins Rydia. That is what Japan does. They also love their Leo. Has been the other deck that they've like really taken under their wing that kind of Western tournaments just haven't seen as much of, right? And that leads us to Opus 19. Or sorry, Opus 20. I guess no, sorry, we're in Opus 19 now. And this list ended up topping. And this is, I think, one of the most wildly creative lists ever. Essentially, we're using Rydia and Sildra as an engine to get our Warrior of Light online, and because we're on Rosa anyway for Warrior of Light and Une, and the Fusoya is a really good idea in a list like this that helps. We're on this critical mass of 4 characters that makes Rydia a good idea again. And summons are still really good. Sildra is the reason this deck functions. Being able to cast Sildra for free multiple times is insanely good. Casting Amaterasu, Mist Dragon. We've got 3 copies of Hecaton Chair to deal with the 13 matchup. You kind of start to see that this deck has some legs. And even the backups work out really well. The class 4th Moogle Sarah, Princess Sarah means that if you have a Sildra gets you 3 of your 4 backups to play Warrior of Light. When I started playtesting this list, I started kind of realizing, wow, this deck has some real legs to it. And now after Kansas and now San Diego, this is where I'm at with the deck. And I feel pretty confident that as far as a Rydia forward build goes, this is about as good as it gets, maybe with some tweaks here or there. And it's changed quite a bit from the original Japanese list. You'll notice the class 10th Moogles are completely gone. Our summon lineup is completely different. Our forwards have diversified quite a bit. We're not as all in on the Rydia forward plus Warrior of Light Fusoya as we were. But our list is really good. So let's go kind of card by card so you can kind of understand how this deck plays and what it's doing. So again, we'll start off, we're going to go over our backups. So first things first, class 4th Moogle is the most important backup in the deck. If you see a hand with this, plus access to any other backup, usually it's worth keeping, unless like the other backup is exactly Shantoto or maybe the Princess Sarah. But even like class 4th plus Sildra is a hand you can keep. Sarah, for Princess Sarah is almost always declared Wind outside of specific matchups, where you can declare her as Earth. We have the 1 Geomancer and Kryle. These are just probably the most consistent Sildra searchable Earth backups. Kryle's really good in general. I've definitely played lists where I've run multiple Kryles just for the extra EX burst and the ability to hard draw her. But the number diversity is really important just due to the way Sildra works. So a 1-1 split here is actually quite nice. Kate Sith, this gets cut from a lot of lists, but it is very good generally to have more forward recursion because we're on such a low density of forwards. That kind of being able to spoof an extra name is nice. Being another rainbow backup's really nice as well. You do end up with like awkward situations where you draw like Kate Sith, Kryle, and Geomancer as your early backups and just like can't do anything. But you can't be locked out of casting Warrior of Light in this deck, which is really important. Lastly, we're on 3 Tyro, 2 Shantoto to kind of round it out. These are pretty self-explanatory. Any kind of rainbow-focused Earth deck is going to be on essentially this number of cards. For the forwards, there's a couple of different modes for the deck. So we have the Rydia mode. So Rydia and the Purims, I'm on 2 Legend, 1 EX. You can kind of flip the ratio there. Either way is fine. I just like being able to hard draw this Purim more often than the EX Purim, but the EX is really nice. The Rosa and Cecil and Fusoya all help power it up. Fusoya and Warrior of Light make a really nice pairing together. But because we want to be set up before we ever cast Fusoya, 2 generally feels about correct. You kind of have access to him when you want him. Cecil you can use to get out your Warrior of Light early, but also Cecil getting in a Category 4 character means you get 2 backups back. I've had turns where I go like Rydia, Warrior of Light, Cecil play Rosa, Cecil then activates 2, and then play a Purim or something. It's not very difficult to line that up. And the extra protection for Rydia is really, really nice. Une is as powerful as I think we thought she was when we first read the deck. Being able to kind of, for 4 CP, you kind of set your opponent back 1 turn when you do it. You remove a forward. If it's a perpetual threat forward, that's really, really nice. If it's an ETB one, you can usually just even leave it there. But bouncing backups is so devastating. I mean, even in this list, like, you don't really want to replay Tyro, but you will. You don't really want to replay Sarah too many times. You know, we're only on the 5 Sarah targets. You kind of can just make your opponent make bad trades and also cut them off of the 4 colors because Warrior of Light has to be cast off of backups. We have the 1 copy of Galif in here. This is an anti-13 tech. Pretty self-explanatory. You can just kind of... He doesn't do the job by himself, but usually if he's paired with any other form of anti-13 stuff, whether that's the 2CP Purim forward, a 5CP Heck, a Shantoto, he can kind of slow the game enough to where you can kind of smokescreen and get yourself set up. And 1 copy of Garnet, just a generally good card that's Soldier searchable. 3 is not a contested number in the deck at all, so makes it just a nice thing to be able to get off of the Soldier if you need it. And then we're on the Best Friends Club, 1 copy of Sarah Mobius, 1 copy of Sophie. Sarah Mobius is maybe one of my favorite cards in the game. She's so good when she comes up. Like it's hard to overstate how impactful it is to be able to search this like 2 CP forward that either draws you a card or causes a fight. And you'll notice a lot of our removal between stuff like Fusoya, Une, Levy 6, a lot of the removal in this deck is bounce focused. So being able to force a fight and put the target in the break zone instead actually is very, very relevant. For the summons, 1 copy of Azura. This just kind of ends up being a nice thing to do with Rydia. 2 copies of Kusith. Again, we're kind of being able to spoof a higher forward count with that. 2 Mist Dragon, 2 Amat. It's a little weird to not be running the full 3 Amat, but because it's not something you necessarily want to hardcast in this list, I've generally found that 2 gives you access to it off of Une and the Garnet or the Purim when you need it, but not so much that it kind of gums up your hand and bricks you. 3 copies of Sildra. This is, again, your best setup tool, your best combo tool. Sildra getting Warrior of Light Fusoya is just game determinatively powerful. The 2 Fenrir. This is essentially your mirror breaker. It allows you to both force a fight or a draw with Sarah Mobius and break any of these backups in the mirror, which usually can set your opponent back a turn. It's really, really nice. And then the Heka as your anti-13 card, plus the 1 copy of Levy 6. Essentially, it's kind of a removal EX mixed with a Kusith for any of the water forwards, so it just can't get back the Cecil, the Galif, or the Rydias. There is one more Rainbow Rydia list. This is Brian Berkeley's list from San Diego. And you'll notice that this list isn't on the Rydia forward. Instead, it's opting to use the incredibly powerful Rydia backup. Because we have the name lock, we can't run both, so you have to run the different sets of forwards. You'll notice that kind of to make up the power deficit, they're running stuff like Braska, 2 Furion, 2 Zidane. These are cards that are trying to make up for the difference. I believe that's the wrong Fenrir. Should be the 3-drop Fenrir. But you start to kind of see where that power gap lies, right? I personally like my version of the list more. I know that Sam and Okimoto tend to favor this one. You basically trade off some of your ceiling for a lot of consistency. Rydia into Ico represents effectively 2 summon searches. You can kind of use the Rydia to get a lot of different cards. Rydia for Ico plus a Mist Dragon's really good against like a mono water deck. You can get the Braska and the Sildra and kind of just keep setting up. Braska is actually a very good removal engine. We've got a lot of different summons to play with it. I like this list a lot. It's definitely solid, but naturally I'm going to prefer my own list. It's just kind of how card games work in general. But you should be like aware that this list exists. And instead of being able to do the Rydia control, it's going to try to sculpt your hand with Zidane, kind of use the haste with Fury to end the game quickly. It still has the Warrior of Light Fusoya combo to try to like essentially checkmate the opponent, right? Still very, very powerful. Weaknesses. These are kind of the main things that I've found that cause problems. First off, backup destruction. You want to break the backups as much as possible. A lot of people like this list because it's a little more insulated against backup destruction. You'll notice that like the Sarah, Ninja, Class 4th, and Ico give you a group of backups that isn't traditionally breakable. I don't know that I like that argument given that like Fusoya and Une are in the format anyway. Like these backups aren't safe. They're just not going to go to the break zone. A lot of times all you're trying to do when you break a backup is slow your opponent down for a turn anyway though. Reliance on rainbow cards means that it's very, very open to getting Chaos Arced. I think that the Rydia forward build is a little better in the matchup, just given that you can go Princess Sarah as Earth and kind of spoof being Earth Wind or Earth Water until you like feel comfortable. Because you can go Class 4th, Sarah, Princess Sarah, and Tyro, and that gives you Tyro for Wind, so you can actually cast your Warrior of Light still if you're in a situation where you feel safe to do so. It's relatively slow. This deck does tend to be able to be run down by card decks like Ice Lightning sometimes. You give Mono Water plenty of time to kind of get the Leviathan Lena set up. You're prone to getting run down by 13. Because again, a lot of times you want one backup plus Sildra. Sildra does cost 2 CP, so you can kind of like get to the 4 backups with one card in hand, but on turn 2. But a lot of decks by that point have dealt you 3 points of damage and are kind of daring you to keep up. And Break Zone Hate. Mist Dragon is shockingly good against this deck. The ability to remove all of your opponent's toolboxes off of the Une. You can kind of eat the Break Zone out from under a Fenrir or cancel the Fenrir outright. A lot of the deck is built on recurring the low forward count from the Break Zone using Kusith, so blanking the Kusith with the Mist Dragon, while also kind of removing win conditions ends up being very, very good. These are just some cards that I found are really, really good against the deck. Heka doesn't need too much of an introduction. Chaos Arc is a whole archetype of cards that are coming out specifically to combat this deck. Mist Dragon I already mentioned. Cloud is really good. Cloud allows you to kill both a Warrior of Light and an Une or a Rydia and an Une. In this list, you still get the Une, but you can also pop a Zidane or a Warrior of Light. There's just a lot of really good things that Cloud ends up killing. Vincent kind of does a backup break in a way. It still just kind of locks your opponent down for a turn. Similarly, Zeromus can kind of make it difficult to get the 4 colors to cast Warrior of Light, while kind of continuously being an aggro card. Lock does very similar things, but also allows you to break an Une or disrupt setup in the process. Leo is a weird one because Leo doesn't always do it, but I have legitimately lost to a Leo just saying my entire hand was dead. Vanille, because this deck again wants to get set up like a turn 1 or turn 2 Vanille actually does mean that all of a sudden those Sarahs cost 6 or the Cryals cost 6, and you kind of start to really run your opponent dry of resources. She's only really good early. Once you get past a certain point, your opponent's just going to start to... I just dropped some notes in my lap. Your opponent's going to start to have the Warrior of Light to kill the Vanille. You're just not going to get value out of it. But for early setup, Vanille is extremely problematic for this deck. Zidane, a similar idea. You can kind of rip what your opponent's doing from their hand before they start doing things. Lastly, this is kind of a weird one. I'm mentioning Man in Black, but really any continued value forward that you're okay casting early with 9,000 power. 9,000 is just a very awkward mark for this deck to hit. It doesn't really get there outside of Warrior of Light and either a fight effect off of Viscera or the Rosa. And anything else that you do, Fusoya is going to bounce it to hand, Une is going to bounce it to hand, Levy 6 bounces it to hand. It just gets to be kind of awkward to remove, right? Even something like Galuf is going to have to remove part of the break zone to deal with a card like Man in Black. It ends up being kind of this like awkward thing that the opponent doesn't really have a great response to. So I've actually found that Man in Black is a real problem card for Rainbow Rydia. Anyways, that's the video, about 25 minutes. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see y'all next time. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this, and if there's any other decks you guys want deep dives of, and how they function, where they came from, what the deck's good at, what's bad at. I could talk about this stuff for ages. So, yeah, laters.